Hello, everyone. Welcome to this live stream episode of the Comical Heathen podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe, and I'm glad that anyone is here listening to us. And I say us because I am joined by a very good friend of mine who's going to be today's guest co-host, Joh Hensler. How are you, John?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Jerry?
I am okay. Hey, for people listening now or in the future, when I post this, the Comical Heathen is a podcast I started a couple of years ago as part of a research project. Sorry, I'm not smart enough to do the live chat and talk to you at the same time. So I'm writing a book about satire is what I'm saying. And I started interviewing some other comedians. In fact, if you go back to the catalog, the most recent interview is with John Fugelsang from Sirius FM. So go listen to that interview. But that's why I started the podcast, so I could have an excuse to interview people for my book. And then that transformed into a live show that I started taking on the road last year, about 7 minutes before the coronavirus pandemic hit. So there hasn't been much live comedy going on at that point.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, just how you're dealing with all of that. Because I know a lot of people are doing stuff with Zoom and different platforms like that. So just wondering, like, what kind of live shows do you have? Have you been booked? Are you booking any shows yourself? And what's going on with you as far as that goes?
Oh, well, yeah, thanks for the quick update. I'll keep it brief, but when venues started reopening over the summer, I have featured a couple times at the Funny Stop down in Cuyahoga Falls. Pete down there does have the tables spaced out and they're practicing social distancing. And it seems okay if you feel comfortable going out. It's probably a good place to go. So I've done some shows there. I haven't done any live shows with the Comical Heathen other than working on the podcast part of it. It's just working on the writing and working on the book and then waiting. I basically said to myself, I'm going to wait till next year. So I'll start looking for bookings for the Comical Heathen in January and February if things are at least settled down, if not improved by then.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird, just because it's like it's hard to plan out anything definitively in the future because who knows what it's even going to look like in a month or two to even figure out. So I figure I'm not funny enough to risk anybody's life anymore. So I'm kind of staying in, waiting to see how everything pans out next year and what's going to happen with this election and where we're going to be next spring and summer. So it'll be interesting, I guess.
Goss, who is listening right now, just sent me a question about the podcast. He asked if I ever do conversations with comedians about their thoughts on performing at colleges nowadays. A great question when it comes to satire or even just sort of edgy. There's kind of a feeling that it's hard that colleges want sort of bland, vanilla, safe comedians. And that some headliners like Jerry Seinfeld and others have just said they won't do colleges anymore. Bill Maher has had trouble with colleges. So there's definitely something there to talk about. I will just say on the podcast, I focus more on satire and religious satire. And that topic has come up a couple times along the way, but I wouldn't call it like a main thing that we talk about.
I'd be interested to talk about it sometime, though, on maybe a separate podcast or have you on, because it's something that's interesting to me because I'll say this and then kind of let it be at that. I feel like a lot of old comedians feel like they have a tough time performing at colleges. A lot of younger comedians, maybe not so much. I think it's maybe just a fact of maybe you're just that's not your demographic anymore. You know, maybe Jerry Seinfeld's time doing colleges is done. And now that's more a younger person's game who's kind of more attached to that kind of crowd, you know?
Well, it's definitely true that like deans of student activities, at least at some colleges, they're the gatekeepers who usually book comedians. And if you're not an A-lister who has, name recognition, they're probably not going to book a road comic or a local comic who isn't sort of a PG or safe. At least as a generalization, that's probably true.
Right.
I will say I teach at Lake Erie College and I book comedians directly through the theater department. And I tell people, I tell the comedians, you do whatever you want. This is a free speech zone. And I tell the students and audience, this is a free speech zone, and the comedian's going to say whatever they want, including adult language or any content they want to cover. And I have never had a complaint from anyone about any of the shows or comedians I've booked. I did once, and I want to confirm this because local or Cleveland-based comic Jeremy Shear once did a show for me, and he gets really blue, even sort of disgustingly blue. And someone threw up once at my college. Like a student had to run to the bathroom. I witnessed that. So that goes to show.
What what's the author's name? Chuck Palahniuk or whatever his name is, where he goes and does readings and people just throw up at the readings. I guess that's as good as a laugh, I guess, right?
Well, if you want a reaction.
Yeah.
But I will say,
a guttural.
Even when that happened, no one actually complained. I mean, so I wonder if the gatekeepers are being a little too, sheepish about what the students can tolerate.
Right. And I think at the end of the day, you can say what you want to say if it's funny and you're not kind of, diminishing people or marginalizing people. If you're making a good point and you're making it in a way that's kind of raunchy or using certain kind of language, as long as the point is on point and you're being funny, I think most people are pretty open to comedy. So,
hey, another live listener, Joe Computer Dude, literally just asked me if how I compare just situations in other countries I've lived to now. I don't know if he just means having Donald Trump as president or other social factors or comedy. I will just say, John, and I don't want to get into an hour long. This is also probably for a separate podcast.
Yeah.
I lived in Japan and New Zealand collectively for over 10 years, and both of those countries have forms of universal health care. And people in America just don't know what they're talking about. And people complain that, I don't know, that it's somehow awful to have socialized health care, are just, blissfully or willfully ignorant. I will not say that either country's healthcare system was perfect, but given how fucked up our healthcare system is, I'll take their imperfections over our fucked it upness. So, but that's all I'll say about that, unless you have a follow-up question, John.
Well, I'll just say this real quick, and then we can get into some of the questions I've written and that some other people sent in. But
sure,
I used to be one of those people who would say, "Oh, well, if you like Canada's socialized medicine so much, just go there." And my brother was actually in Italy for a semester studying abroad, got a moped, flipped himself off the handles, and had to go get stitches in his chin.
Yep.
And I remember saying, "Oh, yes, you had to go get Italian socialized medicine, didn't you?" And he was like, "Yeah, it was really nice." I walked right in there and was worried because I was in a different country. I wasn't sure about not having insurance in this country and how this was going to work out. They went in. I was there for like a half hour, 45 minutes. They stitched me up, and I was on my way. It was like, and to me, it was kind of like, oh, that doesn't sound so bad. What am I so worried about?
Well, I have 3 kids. My first 2 kids were born in Japan, and both of them, my wife went to with a doctor, birthing clinic. We were never given any bills of any kind. Her first child, because it was the first one, they let her stay for a week to recuperate. And the city that we lived in had a new birth fund where they just gave you like $1,000 to cover the cost of things.
Oh, nice. My
third child happened to be born in America, about while we were still living in Japan, and the hospital took care of my wife. All of the professional medical care was fine. On the way out, we had to meet with the billing office about how we were going to pay for all of this. My brothers, they had their kids in America and they had insurance. And my one brother was telling me that his deductible was $5,000 and that counted for his wife and his newborn. So he was given a bill for $10,000 on his way out of
Oh gosh.
So would prefer the Japanese system where you went in for 3 days and you left with $1,000,
Yeah, instead of having to go bankrupt because you had a kid.
So that's actually the thing the biggest difference that I talk about when people ask me what it was like. But the purpose of today's podcast is to talk about religion, satire, pseudoscience, and I was particularly fishing around online for people to ask me questions about conspiracy theories. So we're going to go, keep this to about an hour. We started at 3, so we got about 45 minutes left. John, why don't we get into some of these questions that people sent in?
So the first one isn't really about conspiracy theories, but we'll gradually get into it.
Sure.
Maybe it is.
I said people could ask questions about anything, so what the heck?
Yeah. And this is definitely, I feel like this is a question my dad would ask. That's not an insult. My dad asks good questions. So, so the first question is from John Heese, I believe his last name is, why do 7-Eleven doors or any place that's open 24 hours a day have locks on the doors?
So I do want to give a shout out to John. I know John. He actually is a Canadian fellow who lives in Japan, and he and I became friends when I was in Japan in the 90s. And we're still Facebook friends. That E is they call it a German vowel. So it's Hayes,
S.
actually. Hayes.
Oh, okay, like Heyes.
Double E comes out as a A, I guess.
Hayes.
At least that's how they do it in Canada. So what the heck? But so yeah, so I know John. I haven't seen him for many years, but we keep in touch on Facebook. Yeah, I mean first of all, there's a very simple answer. That is because when you go to the door store, they only sell doors that have locks on them. there's no door store that sells doors without locks.
Fair. That's fair.
And then also you never know when you might have to lock the door. When I was in high school, a quick boring story, everybody. So this is your chance to go to the bathroom if you have to. I mean, young too, like 13 or 14. A friend of mine and I went for a walk one weekend, like Friday or Saturday. And, we were kids. We weren't up to no good, but we were up to nothing. And while walking around, we would always do this joke where we'd walk up to a store that was closed. And like we go, wouldn't it be great if this door opened and, it'd be locked, right? So I'm sure you can see where this is going. There was some convenience store. It was after midnight. I went up to the door like, wouldn't it be great if this door was open? And it opened. And the store was closed. Lights turned out. It totally freaked us out. There was a bar next door. We went in, and the owner of the bar knew the owner of the store, and blah, blah, blah. Now, the only thing that makes this story even remotely worth telling was that years later, I mean like 15 years later, I was talking to my older sister, and she started telling me a story that one time she was working at a convenience store, and she did the morning shift, and then the boss called her and said the second shift person had called off. Could she do a double shift? So she did. So she worked 16 hours. And then the boss called again and said, the third shift person called off. Can you do another shift? And she left.
Yeah.
But when she left, she forgot to lock the door. That was the store. I literally am the person who found out that my sister, totally by a cosmic coincidence, was the one who didn't lock the door.
That is crazy. That's so weird how things kind of like tie back into that. Like, when did you find out that like that happened? Like, was that like years later? Or was
yes,
that, like,
I mean the thing I had that weird door opening in the middle of the night when I was 13 or 14, and I was probably talking to my sister in my 30s.
Oh wow!
So at least 15 to 20 years later.
That's really funny. Well, you know what? My God, or at least my prophet, Bob Dobbs, his power is the power of coincidence. So clearly that's a weird coincidence. You were visited by Bob Dobbs at that point. So
when I teach a class on critical thinking skills, and there's a little known fancy word, which is apophenia. So your homework this weekend, everybody who's listening, is to work the word apophenia into a conversation with your friends. But that is the sort of cognitive bias or heuristic where your mind seeks patterns where there are none.
And that's actually a really good, I mean, leading into some of these conspiracy theory questions. I feel like that is a giant glossary word, so to speak, talking about that.
Yes.
So heading into that, this one's getting a little bit closer, I think, to conspiracy theories, at least in that vein. This one, I think you said came from like the live questions or the live show you did.
So the live show, I've done it a few times. John here was actually the host of one of the live performances. And we have a Q&A section in the live show, which it's fun to interact. And I do improv, so it's fun to just screw around and be on the spot. But it's probably the feedback I've gotten from audiences. It's their favorite part. Like, who cares about my jokes and stories? The Q&A, like always, the energy level goes way up.
Well, people like seeing people as they are. When you're doing, stand up, you're doing a caricature of yourself. When you're doing the Q&As, you're kind of just you. I think people like kind of connecting with that.
Yeah.
But this person wants to know, since only some psychics get arrested for fraud, does that mean the ones who don't get arrested for fraud are legit?
Oh, I remember that question. And, that question resonated when it came up in the live show, because when I teach critical thinking classes at the college, I sometimes, show articles of psychics who've been arrested and talk about that topic. And then this question will get asked. Somebody will usually ask, well, how come some psychics get arrested and some don't? Basic, shall we say, just like fortune telling and mediums, basically, are protected by the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. So just, doing a tarot card reading, even for 10 or 20 bucks, that's, considered like a form of entertainment by the government. So I'm not saying that's right or even that I agree with it, but that's sort of why they get away with it, legally speaking. The ones who get arrested are the ones who take it up a notch to where it becomes not even just fraud, but almost like blackmail. Like they'll say, oh, you're being haunted by the evil spirits. You have to pay me $100,000 to dispel them.
Okay.
And then when it gets up to that level, so if it's basically like a nickel and dime situation, like you walk by a store and it says psychic, there's a sign, psychic, come on in for reading for $10. That's generally protected by the First Amendment, not by their veracity or skills. And then the ones who get arrested tend to have elevated it to a much higher level of fraud and intimidation.
It's almost like the multi-level marketing schemes
Mm-hmm.
where it's like all of those are fraud, but it's like at what level does it reach the actual legal definition of fraud instead of just being kind of a dishonest, kind of backhanded or underhanded way of making money, you know?
And it gets a little bit into like the sunk cost
Right.
fallacy, where when someone spends a little money, they feel like they have to follow it up, even if they're not sure. So, you go in for $25 reading, and then they say, well, for $100, I'll sell you this amulet, or for $200, I'll give you a private
Right.
reading. And then it like slowly the amounts of money get bigger. And so it's not like you walk in on the first day and they try to charge you $100,000.
Right.
It's that it's slowly, they squeeze you slowly. It's harder to walk away.
Once.
Yeah.
When I was first kind of coming out of my religious beliefs and kind of really kind of owning my skepticism, I went to a psychic with the sense of, I want to go here just to see, like, I didn't really believe, but it's like, maybe there is something here. Let's check it out. And it was just very basic, just typical cold reading stuff. And
Right.
she said, I think it was actually right as I was starting to do comedy, but at the time I was like an assistant manager at a movie or at a restaurant. And she said, oh, the job you're at right now is a job that you've always wanted. And, you're going to move forward doing this job. What do you do, by the way? She said, well, you're a psychic, shouldn't you know? So I told her, I said, well, I'm a assistant manager at a restaurant. Oh, yeah, this is the job that's made for you, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, yeah, but I really don't like it, though. And it was just so funny. She was so wrong, but then she would try to like shift to like certain points. And then at the end of it, I just wasn't convinced, and she could tell. And she said, well, if you had a crystal ball reading for $50 more, that would really be able to tell me. No, I think I'm just happy getting suckered out of $10.
Well, I'm glad that you were suckered out of no more than $10, but it is, for people listening at home, John and I have never discussed this before. I've never heard that anecdote before. And it is kind of like apt that the exact thing I described in general is what happened to him in his story.
Where was I going to go? Oh, so the first question I was going to kind of ask you is, so when I was young, I was like really into conspiracy theories, and I'm saying when I was middle school and high school, and I feel like there's a point in time in my life where I was kind of figuring out who I was, and everybody kind of figures it out at that point in time in their life. But to me, I was kind of looking at it as like, I didn't know what it was to be skeptical, but I knew I wanted to be skeptical. And I considered myself a skeptic. And I wanted that to be part of my persona, right? And so to me, I kind of didn't understand the difference between skepticism and cynicism.
Sure.
Me being a good skeptic was just disbelieving everything and doubting everything. And, especially like the stuff that's just the standard, status quo. So to me, I was never the kind of kid or person who said, oh, well, we never landed on the moon. That was all fake. I would say, well, yeah, we probably landed on the moon, but there's these interesting, videos or, I'm not saying that, Oswald didn't act alone, but it's, it's worth thinking about. And so I never really committed to believing in the conspiracy theories, but it was kind of like, I liked the fact that made me feel like I was skeptical. And I feel like after a while, true skepticism kicked in to where, I would follow these rabbit holes down and then finally get to the point where it was like, there's nothing here though. Like there's no actual evidence. It's just a void of evidence. It's just, isn't it weird how we have all these questions? So I feel like by the time by like September 11th hit, I was already skeptical as conspiracy theories. Like my first instinct was to doubt them and to, actually look into them. So I guess my question is like, what is so compelling about conspiracy theories that we're, I mean, here we are, talking about them to people who are skeptical. So what is so compelling about them, and why do some people fall for them while other people can kind of look through the muck and mire and kind of see what they really are?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for all of that, John, and also being the academic that I guess I am, or that I know I am. I took like 2 pages of notes while you were just talking. Like, there's like I have 18 bullet points now that I want to get through.
Yeah.
I do want to say that there's a very nice book. It's from the 90s, so maybe a couple of the examples in it are dated, but it's Michael Shermer's book, Why People Believe Weird Things. Mm-hmm. And a key thing that comes out of that book, just one of like the main points of the whole book, is that the answer is not because they're stupid. Mm-hmm. And that is one thing that I think the humanists and skeptics, including myself and just anyone, it would be a trap, like a mistake, like stepping on a mine in a minefield, to blame it, whatever it is, whatever part of the Venn diagram we're talking about, on stupidity or intelligence or low IQ. The way the brain functions sort of psychologically comes with a lot of foibles. And some of those foibles can help us survive, and some of those foibles can blind us without us realizing it. I do think humans are storytelling animals. That's not a big revelation, by the way, folks. So I'm sure no one fell off their couch. But we explain things with stories. You and I have already told stories to explain some of our comments and answers. Mm-hmm. And stories have morals, and stories have points, and stories have punchlines. And sometimes a good story can be compelling, regardless of how factually accurate it is. So when you hear a conspiracy theory about blah, 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 9/11, or blah, 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 we didn't land on the moon, without any reference to its factuality or validity, it's probably a good story. And so people can be drawn. And if the person telling the story is charismatic, almost like a performance art, people can be drawn to that. So it is, I think that is part of it. Like, storytelling not only enriches our lives, but does inform us how to be a human and how to participate in our own societies, like of morals and etiquettes and what that kind of stuff. But it can also, derail us. I do like your little, commentary about the word skeptical. Another thing I talk about in class a lot, because it's a word that gets misused. People who deny climate change are sometimes called climate change skeptics. Wrong. They are not skeptics. They are, climate change deniers. Mm-hmm. And although I will not call them stupid collectively, they are climate change ignorant of the facts, which is, the skeptic's credo is often associated with Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Right.
So skeptics are into evidence. If you can present us with evidence, we will be very interested. Actually, a skeptic is open-minded, not cynical and closed-minded, as you pointed out.
Right.
So people who want to, John, what got me into this a couple of weeks ago is I had lunch with a friend of mine, well-read, again, smart guy, but he is way down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole. And he was going off about not only 9/11, but the school shooting. That's to put it kindly, that's in very poor taste.
Yes.
You're going to say that school shooting was, staged with crisis actors, and no one was really killed, and it's just the government trying to take your guns away from you. Mm-hmm. That is amazingly
insensitive.
Insensitive. Yes. Thank you for helping me finish that sentence. And another friend of mine I was telling this about said that he would have walked out, but he couldn't have continued to sit at the table with someone who was going off on Sandy Hook conspiracy theories. To go back to just being skeptical and being open-minded, there's something I've noticed about, I'm going to say most conspiracy theories, and you touched on it a little bit. In conspiracy theories, a lack of evidence is considered evidence. Mm-hmm. Like, in no other realm of science or history would we say, well, there's no evidence of this happening, that's why we believe it happened.
Right.
But what I mean is, if you start talking about like UFOs, and someone will say, well, it's a government cover-up, or the military's got all that information. That's not evidence. Go get the evidence. If that's what you think is happening, Go get the evidence and show me. But until then, you can't say it's all a cover-up. Like, that's not evidence. That's actually the lack of evidence that they then like spin onto its head and try to use it as evidence. So there have been, and I've only done like half these bullet points, John, but this will be the last one. There have been in history and in real life conspiracies. You know, a group of men got together and conspired to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. But that was not a conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy fact. There's evidence, there's facts. It can be researched. It can be counter-researched, and you can study the evidence. Just like climate change skeptics are using the word skeptic wrong, conspiracy theorists are using the word theory wrong. They do not have theories. They have stories.
Conjecture, right. Blanket conjecture.
It has conspiracy theory, stories, and conjectures. A theory, of course, is a wide-ranging, compelling explanation of the natural world based on evidence and capable of predicting the future. So conspiracy theories have none of those things.
Right. Yeah, that's what a lot of people who I kind of argue conspiracy theories with get to the point where they say, well, you're just not willing to open your mind and accept anything that's not just on the norm. And you just wouldn't believe a conspiracy theory. And I say, I actually do believe conspiracy theories. You know, like, I don't know if anybody in your audience knows who Gary Webb is. I won't get too far into it, but he essentially uncovered the fact that the United States government was selling cocaine in, New York and Los Angeles, which started the crack epidemic. That is an actual fact, and you can look into that and see that, he published an article in the San Jose Times, and that was shut down because obviously, the CIA didn't want it run, and he ended up committing suicide. And that's where I kind of don't know where to take the conspiracy theory. That's kind of why I drop it, because a lot of people say, oh, he committed suicide, huh? And to me, yeah, like you said, until you prove that there was something nefarious about his death, I'm not going to believe it. But it is a fact that he did uncover this, had a newspaper article before it got buried. And that's a true thing that seems crazy and against the norm, like the government doing this. But it is something that is true. So I will believe a conspiracy theory when it reaches that level of being proven.
So I'll just say, I don't know any of the facts of your case, so I'll just let your story stand on its own, merits for the purposes of our conversation. I'll just say, when things like that are uncovered, those are conspiracies. They're not theories. Like, there are conspiracies in life and in history and in government, to be sure. I'm certainly not advocating that everyone should just believe everything, that the president said, for example. Like, we shouldn't just trust the government for no good reason either. But conspiracy, theories and theorists, another big problem, John, there's a saying, some of people in the audience may have heard this before. It's a famous mafia saying, 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead.
Right. Yeah. And even then, you still got to worry about the one guy.
You're correct. So almost any famous conspiracy theory, I watched that documentary. I can't think of the name of it. If anyone knows, go ahead and type it in for me. It was on Netflix the past couple of years about the flat earthers. Beyond the Edge, Beyond the Horizon.
Beyond the Curve.
Beyond the Curve.
Yeah, that was good.
Yes. And I didn't realize until watching that documentary that flat earthers are the conspiracy theory of all conspiracy theories.
Oh, yeah.
Because you kind of have to believe almost every other conspiracy theory along the way. And just to, go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to say, I wonder how much of that is people actually believing this, or people making money off the fact that they can get people to believe this,
Well, that comes back to me referring to conspiracy theories as a form of storytelling. If someone can have a podcast or do a speech and they're charismatic and compelling and it's kind of performance art, then so be it. But it doesn't make what they're saying true. And again, it does seem like flat earthers in particular seem to have a lot of fun. So when you're online, you can't be sure if they might be joking around or how serious they are. But just to take, whether it's flat earthers, the moon landing being faked as a conspiracy theory, just how many people would have to be involved?
Right.
It's not just Stanley Kubrick. You know, he had a whole movie crew. He had a whole studio. He had actors. He had all the astronauts. You know, that's you can't have a conspiracy with hundreds of participants. That's not how they function.
And that's one of my biggest arguments with the 9/11 conspiracy is there would have to be so many people. I mean, just the contractors who came into the building to take down the drywall, put up the explosives, put the drywall, like there's just so many people on various levels. And because in a certain level, some people in government know how to keep a secret, and the CIA and stuff like that. But even then, time is going to expose those. But if you just have just random people who have to be involved with this, somebody somewhere is going to spill the beans. And I guess that's why they blew up Building 7, I guess, right?
Yeah, well, yes. They put all the people who knew about the conspiracy in Building 7.
Yeah, in Building 7, All right, so my next question is going to kind of hit on some of the vacuum of evidence, because I feel like it's difficult arguing with people who believe in conspiracy theories, because it's hard, because showing them actual evidence is difficult, because they're just going to find out with some other vacuum of evidence that just dismisses that and say, well, what about this? So that's kind of a hard argument, because you're arguing a lot of nuance there. One of the weird things to me, though, is the end of the world conspiracy theories of, the world's going to end on this specific date in this specific year, this specific time. And then that comes and passes, and all the people who followed this person who made these predictions still somehow believe the nonsense that they come up with. Well, this is why I interpret it wrong or whatever. Like, what's the psychology behind that, where you can see someone is obviously wrong and still say, oh, but they're going to be wrong next time, or right next time,
Right. Like, I do think there's some identity politics involved. There's some philosophers who've pointed out that when you interpret language, like a deeply or meta, like deconstruct language, when people make claims about what they believe in, it's not relevant whether or not they believe in what they're saying. What's relevant is that they're identifying themselves. So that's where you get into, it wasn't your question, but it's the big example would be people who say that they're a Christian, but don't follow any teachings of Christ or the Bible that are identifiable.
Right.
Now, some of those people might be hypocrites or liars, but to give people the benefit of the doubt, since I can't read their minds or see into their hearts, in the very least, some of those people are just identifying themselves. It's like, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Christian. It's a kind of identity politics. And I think that goes into it, like with the flat earthers, like the ones that were in that documentary that take at least a little more seriously, or a little more invested, maybe I should say. That's their identity. And once you're self-identifying yourself, it's hard to deprogram yourself. One little fact or one little conversation with John or Jerry or one podcast episode is not going to convince somebody to deconstruct their identity.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to, the sunken cost concept.
I was thinking the same thing.
This is who I am. For me to say, oh, I'm wrong, I don't have to completely change who I am. Like, I used to be very conservative for most of my life until really just a few years ago. And I think for a long time I wasn't conservative, but wouldn't make the jump to calling myself a moderate or more moderate or liberal or whatever until Trump came along. And I think it was, and this is kind of realization I just had, to where my identity was a conservative. But once I didn't want to identify as a conservative that was the Trump conservative, that's what kind of made me have the willingness to kind of be, okay, well, I'm not that anymore. Let me explore then what I am and find out where I do stand on this political spectrum.
Yeah. And part of the irony to me of that is there's another sort of psychological point, which is, sometimes called something like the illusion of consistency, which is that most people think, consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously or preconsciously, that they've been the same person their whole life. Like, because they construct a backstory narrative for themselves where they haven't changed.
Right.
And so even when they do change, they don't think they're a different person. So they just see it as a continuation of who they've always been.
Right. That's interesting, because sometimes I have to fight, like, placing my current self on myself 10 years ago. Right. And then say, I wouldn't have thought that 10 years ago, though. I would, that's not how my mind would have worked.
Yep. 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 John, I know exactly what you mean. In the 90s, I voted for Bush the Elder.
Yeah, so did I. So, no,
I'm-
not in the 90s. In the 2000s, I did. I
right.
wouldn't have been old enough yet in the 90s. So,
Well, you voted for Bush the Younger then.
yes.
I'm a little
So, yeah,
older than John.
So actually, I don't know if you know this, but I actually, my church, the Free and Critical Thinking Church of Autonomous Thought, or Buddyism, actually has an end of the world prophecy.
Okay. What's your end of the world prophecy?
So, as you know, my religion is kind of loosely based off of the Church of the Subgenius. And Bob Dobbs in 1980 predicted that the end of the world would be on July 5th, 1998. Now, I know what you're thinking is 1998, that's come and gone already, but that's just because you're pink and don't really know the way of the world, Jerry. Everybody knows that the conspiracy has changed the calendar how many times, from taking years off, putting years on, taking months out, adding extra days. So we really have no clue what year we're currently in. We just know that it's not July 5th, 1998 yet, right?
Oh, right.
So I think I figured out by studying the ancient texts and scriptures, aka American dystopian novels, and what I've come to the conclusion of, we're obviously very clearly, and I don't think anybody can deny this, living right smack in the middle of 1984, right?
Sure.
That seems very obvious. So what that tells me is we have 14 years until the end of the world, or at the very least 14 years to come up with a good excuse as to why it didn't happen. So that's just as good as anybody else's end of the world prophecy. Am I right?
It's very good. I want to point out that a live listener right now just said that for you and me, that don't ask, don't tell. Oh yeah, should apply to anybody who voted for Bush.
Hey, I'm cool with that. I'm cool with that. Don't ask me, and I won't.
Yeah, don't ask, don't tell. Yes.
All right, so here's one thing that I definitely want to kind of get into with you, because I think you and I have talked about this on a personal level before. And I feel like you were kind of engaged with me when I was going through this on Facebook, but I've actually had a true, honest to goodness Mandela effect that kind of blew my mind a few years ago. So I was wondering if you kind of wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit and dive into a conversation on, that whole topic.
So the Mandela effect is when people kind of remember things wrong and are very, very certain that their wrong memory is right.
Right.
It's the phrase Mandela effect refers to sort of people who thought that Mandela had died in jail and then later realized that he was still alive, and that couldn't reconcile. It's almost like having two competing memories in their head.
Right. And this is the thing I wanted to kind of talk about, because before I had my Mandela effect, I understood the concept, I understood where it came from, and I understood a bunch of different examples. Like, for example, like instead of the Berenstain Bears, it's actually the Berenstain Bears.
Yes.
Instead of, we all colloquially think mirror, mirror on the wall, it's actually, if you watch, I think, Snow White, it's magic mirror on the wall. But these things are kind of a little more easily explained because Berenstain, like the Steen is a more common last name than Stain.
Yes.
And then things like the original was magic mirror on the wall, but then someone copied the original and said mirror, mirror on the wall. And somebody copied the copy and then copied. So that stuff kind of seems more, but to me, the actual Mandela effect of having that memory of, no, like I know that Mandela died. And I didn't have that. What I had, I think, was kind of similar in that, and I'll kind of set up quickly if I can. And this is why I think it really blew me away, because I was having an argument with somebody on Facebook who was trying to say the Mandela effect, the Large Hadron Collider, the double slit test, and he kept calling it the multiverse theory, all prove that we slip in and out of different universes. Right. And this all started back in 2013 when they started doing the experiments with Large Hadron Collider, and that's when Nelson Mandela died. So this all proves it. And I'm saying, come on, dude, like this is kind of crazy. Like, so he's telling me, well, no, I can prove to you that history changed. And I said, well, what do you mean by history changing? Like we have a broader sense of history? Like what? He's like, no, what you think happened actually changed. And so he asked me, how many people were in the car when JFK was assassinated? And I'll ask you to see, because it's interesting to me, because I've asked people, like, so were you born when JFK was assassinated? Like, do you remember it happening?
Me? No. I that was before my time, and I have no memory of when it actually, from that time.
because it seems to me that people who were there and remember it will always get the answer right. People who have watched it through TV
Right.
very often get it wrong. They can get it right, but usually they get it wrong. And I have a theory as to why. But I'll ask you, how many people you think were in the car when JFK was assassinated?
I'm gonna. I feel like I should be a better sport and just play along.
Right.
So I will give you an answer in like 10 seconds. But I'm going to tell you my real answer to questions like that is I don't know.
Right.
And I suspect that one of the reasons we get different answers is because of people guessing.
Right. We're a lot more, we feel like we're a lot more confident in what we know than we actually are. So we make a guess. But for me, it was, like I said, I was very much into conspiracy theories.
Right.
So for me, I was like, well, no, I've watched this Zapruder film a million times. I know. And so I very confidently said there were 4 people in the car. It was the president, the first lady, and I was wrong, but I initially said the mayor of Dallas. And that proves the fallacy of memory because it was actually the governor of Texas.
Yeah. There was another.
And then a driver. So there was 4 people. And the guy said, no, you're wrong. There's 6. And they were in a limousine. And so I figured, well, I can prove this wrong. I just go on the internet and find pictures of it. I go to Wikipedia and find it. And I couldn't find an image with just 4 people in the car. I learned now that there was 2 Secret Service agents and the governor's wife. And this was all just brand new information to me. To where I was telling people it's almost as if there were 4 people who went to the moon on Apollo 11 and you just didn't even know about it. And I had to kind of reconcile. And I remember making up fake like memories. Like I would say, I said to myself, like, I remember you asking your dad, because I was thinking the car was a sedan, just a 4-door and not like the extended. And I remember telling my dad, they keep saying the presidential motorcade or the presidential limousine, but that's not a limousine. And I remember my dad telling me, well, limousine isn't necessarily a stretch limo. It's just a nice luxury car that's being chauffeured. So I was like, I remember having that memory, and that's attached to that other memory. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. But then I realized what I was doing was just trying to find a way to make that memory fit. And that was a real memory. But I remember the memories from when my grandma needed a ride to the airport and none of us could give her one. So she got a limo, and I was like, whoa, grandma's showing up in a limo. That's pretty cool. And then it would just end up being a Lexus. So that's where that memory's from. But I robbed it to go, no, this confirms that my initial memory was right. And I think just the fact that I was in an argument that I knew I was right on. I know that the Large Hadron Collider didn't cause rip in time and space, and we're moving in between different universes. So my mind just would not allow myself to admit that I was wrong. And it seriously gave me some PTSD for a couple of days until I was able to work through that cognitive dissonance.
That's a very a real psychological experience that you had. I do think that, our memories are not reliable. And just as the neuroscience of memory is not as accurate as people would think. It's well known to trial lawyers that the least reliable form of evidence is eyewitness testimony. However, it's also the most compelling type of evidence to a jury.
Again, it goes back to storytelling.
Yes. So you got this, that's just like a practical example of the situation of our memories are just not that reliable. In college, I used to date this girl who was from Washington, D.C. And she, we're like teenagers and like 18, 19. And one time she asked me out of the blue what state Washington, D.C. was in. And I thought to myself, I swear to God, this is true. I thought Washington, D.C. was its own thing. I didn't think it was a state. Well, she lived there, so she must know. So I guess it isn't a state. And so I guessed Delaware. And then she laughed at me and goes, see, people don't even know that Washington, D.C. is its own thing. So she was trapping me. But also it just goes back to not guessing. Like that's why, not that I'm me and Kanye West are 2 motherfucking geniuses, but not that I'm a genius. It's just I've learned not to guess answers to things I don't know the answer to.
Right. And that's interesting. There's some shows, speaking of Netflix shows, that's like deals with like this kind of stuff. And one of the things that they did was they asked people, they said, we're going to give you an answer or a question where the answer is a number. And you can just give us like a range. And as long as the number falls within that range, you're right. And they put money on the line. If you get 3 right, you get like $100. And none of the people got any of them right because they were doing such a small range. And they were so confident that they knew around about at least how many books are in the Bible, or how many countries are in Africa, or whatever it is, that they gave like a small enough range that they were outside the range. And the point was, you could have said 1 to 1 million, or 1 to infinity and one, but we're so confident that we know the answer, even when we don't, that we feel like we can make at least an accurate guess, you know?
Well, there's also the anchoring effect, I think. And I do think the anchoring effect is another way to talk about conspiracy theories. The anchoring effect is when the last piece of information you heard takes like an unusual amount of prominence in your like conscious mind, and it ends, or in your unconscious mind as well, preconscious, subconscious, whatever, that it affects what you say or do next. So the biggest example of this is sale prices. If you're in the store and it says, this coat sells for $199, but it's on sale for $99. Your only point of reference are those two numbers. So the first price, the not sale price, is considered like the anchoring effect. I do a thing in class sometimes, John, where I'll ask students, I'll say, this is just a trivia question, you might know, but just write down what you think the answer is. True, false. The population of Vietnam is 10 million people. And then, John, would you say true or false?
I know it's small, but I know it's also heavily populated. So I would guess probably true, I guess. Although I don't know. Okay,
well, and most people don't. It's random trivia. Why would you know?
Right.
So the answer is false. And then I just ask them, I tell them that was false. What do you think the answer is? What do you think the population of Vietnam is? And I get a classroom, 20, 30 students. And I would just say the majority of the students guess the number. What would you guess, John?
Well, we know it's not 10 million.
Correct.
So I'm going to say it's somewhat of a trick question. Maybe it's close to 10 million, so maybe it's 9 million.
So, of course, you could have said anything. And also, when you do sociological or social psychology studies, you do large groups, right? You get 100 or 1,000, and you look for a trend. Right. So the trend is that people will say a number near 10 million because that's the number that they just heard. And the answer is 100 million.
Oh, wow. See, I was thinking, okay, maybe it's, most people are going to go down, because that's what I was thinking. Okay, maybe it's closer to maybe 2 or 3. But then I was like, maybe that's the thing, is like people go way down because it's not 10 million. So it is kind of almost that, where like I was thinking, okay, it's less than 10 million, but it's way more.
So now think about the anchoring effect and someone who doesn't know much about a topic, let's just say 9/11, and then a charismatic speaker tells them, well, you know, black vans were seen there, or someone talking about Sandy Hook says, well, you know, if you look at photos of that school from 1988, it's completely different. And if you were just being open-minded and friendly and having a conversation in the coffee shop, you just heard those things. So they're going to have a kind of prominence in your thinking about the topic, even if you're trying to dismiss it, like, oh, this guy's crazy, or how about there's no crisis actors, but it's still your imagination is being occupied, being anchored by that narrative.
And I think that kind of leads back to where I was as like a middle schooler and a high school kid, to where, you know, I didn't believe this stuff, but just the fact that it was there in my subconscious was enough for me to go, but maybe, you know, there's these questions here that we don't have answers to, you know? So like you said, even if you don't want to believe it, or even if you're questioning it to some extent, it's still just, it's there, you know, it's in your mind and pervasive. And it's really interesting.
When we talk about the lack of evidence, I want to say one other thing from my bullet points from earlier. If you are a person who wants to overthrow any well-established fact or theory, let's say if you're a flat earther and you want to try to prove that the earth is not round, one must do the following. If you could take every book in the library on the earth being round, and you stack them up tall, you would have a huge stack, like I don't even know, about 10 stories tall.
Right.
And now if you are the flat earther, you need to get 11 stories worth of evidence. Like your balance of evidence has to far surpass, not even just get close. Has to far surpass the existing evidence. So if you're a creationist and you're serious about debating science, which none of them are, your balance of evidence has to outpace all the evidence in support of evolution.
Right.
And so this is what every conspiracy theory lacks. If you think, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, because this leads into the kind of the next question I was going to.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes, John. So pick your next 1 or 2 questions. What do you really want to talk about? Yeah. And we'll try to make them like speed rounds. I'll give short answers.
So, this is actually the last one, and it's probably 10 minutes is probably just perfect for us to kind of talk about it. And it kind of ties everything up. Is that like the rise of like QAnon kind of coming with this sense of the internet age, and like you said, to refute an actual founded point, you would have to come with way more information to actually refute it. And this is what I wonder, like, I feel like there is the appearance that there's enough information to refute well-founded, theory or historical, consensus. There's an appearance that there's so much information that contradicts the norm because there's so much stuff on the internet that people can just go and because, there's bloggers out there saying this, because people have this it's almost like we have this weird sense of everybody knows not to trust anything on the internet, but the same token, we still have the sense of, I found it on the internet. There's all this information here. So it lends this credibility to what would otherwise just be your nonsensical uncle talking weird nonsense at Thanksgiving. Now there's some blogger, now there's some right-wing, somewhat legit news source, so to speak, putting this stuff out there, where it's kind of almost difficult to really tell. And it seems like, there is enough evidence to dispute this thing, especially if you already want to believe it.
First of all, there's used to be a kind of a jokey philosophy question of, if you gave 1 million monkeys 1 million typewriters in 1 million years, would they create Hamlet? And the internet has proven the answer to that is no.
We've only had 10 years, Jim.
You're right. Give them time. The monkeys are still out there typing. Give them a chance.
We're still working.
I think the appearance of evidence is a great phrase. I kind of honestly, I think, first of all, anyone listening to this, John on Facebook is fantastic. Please follow him on Facebook. He gets into these great, lengthy debates, which I enjoyed reading, and I occasionally dip into, but I don't do it a lot. And that's partially because I don't get a lot of personal joy out of correcting, conspiracy theories or arguing with trolls online. But I do sometimes want to correct things because I imagine like the third person who might be reading it. Like, I'm not trying to convince the original poster. Right. I'm just trying to get accurate information to balance the whatever BS motivated me. And I want to give an example of that comes from talking to people, to creationists. Something that you'll hear is that, the body is so complicated. How could it, quote unquote, just evolve? And then people start giving examples like a childbirth or the eye. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful eye.
And then, besides the fact that the eye is riddled with flaws and imperfections and could hardly be considered a perfect machine at all, if the person who designed the eye worked for Steve Jobs, he would have fired him from whatever slave camp he was working in at the time. But even aside from all of that, the eye is one of the most studied organs by evolutionary biologists. And so if this hypothetical person who really exists, because I've had this conversation many times, if this hypothetical person were actually interested in the evolutionary history and processes of the eye, there's a lot of interesting information. There's books, there's articles, there's research, there's experiments. There's this is a go-to example. If I actually had regular listeners to this podcast, they've probably heard me say it before, but except for you and me, John, no one else listens to this podcast regularly. I'm going to just repeat this nice data point. There are fish that live in South America in in the mountains. They have some deep lakes. And the fish, over many generations, their offspring worked their way to the bottom of the lake. And at the bottom of the lake, it was so dark that, kind of like cave fish, their eyes stopped functioning. Right. They were blind, and they still had eyeballs, but they were like our appendixes or whatever. They were like useless organs that evolution had no longer had need for. Now, those same fish had offspring that over many generations worked their way back up to the top of the lake. And they grew new eyes inside of their non-functioning eyes. Huh. It's not even that their old eyes somehow turned back on. It's that they re-evolved a whole new set of eyes inside their non-functioning eyeballs. And again, if anybody wants to play the God works in mysterious ways card, feel free. But if we're here to talk about science, evolution explains that.
Right.
And you can go and read about it. And even better, not that everybody will do this, but anybody who is motivated can participate in the project of science. Right. Go do some experiments. Go do some field work. Go into caves and study blind fish. You can do all of those things. In that Beyond the Curve film, there's like one of the subplots is a guy who puts together his own experiments to prove the Earth is round.
Oh, right.
And every one of his experiments proves the Earth is round.
Right.
And he refuses to sort of admit it, at least on camera.
Right.
And I still like that guy because he's proving my basic point. You can go do these experiments yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
And
that's
go ahead.
That's the thing. Because I went through a phase on YouTube where I just found whatever I could to debunk the flat Earth conspiracy. Because there's a lot of people out there doing, showing why these arguments fell. And It's funny because that is one thing that they always say is, oh, these scientists just go to school and they teach them what to say. They teach them, it's almost like a religion, the science of religion.
Right.
And one of the, I think it's Professor Dave talks about it and says, these students go and they learn how to do these experiments. They're not told what is true. They actually go and do the experiments and figure it out on their own. They go to these labs. If you ever went to one of these schools, you would see that they're not just there being taught what to say. They're actually being taught the practical application of this, which, like you said, anybody can do. I mean, even if it's just a simple lab experience for a fifth grader, you can do the process.
When I was like 8 years old, and I probably had some naive child's view of what it means to be a scientist, I decided I would do an experiment. And on the street I grew up on had a lot of buckeye trees. So I walked around one day. I collected like a bag full of buckeyes. I peeled them all because the inside kind of looks like a brain. I don't know if you know what I mean, or anyone listening knows what I mean. But if you peel like the green husk off, there's like the fruity part on the inside. And I put like 20 of those into a cup and filled the cup with water and put it in my closet so I could see what happens. And when it started to smell, my mother went into the closet and asked, "What is this?" And I said, "It's my experiment." And she threw it away.
Well, so what was your conclusion of your experiment?
My conclusion is that if you soak buckeye fruit in a glass of water for a summer, they're going to smell. And your mother will not be pleased with you. We're going to wrap up in a minute. I will say I'll give this episode a quick edit and post it as a permanent episode. So anyone who's listening, please share it with your friends and tell people about my little project, researching satire and doing this Comical Heathen show. John, I don't want to sort of end too abruptly, so let's just do one more quick question of some kind.
Let's see. What's all right? Well, I guess we kind of already covered this.
Sure.
Because one Jace Cooper writer wrote, "Is your intention here to dispel or explore conspiracy theories?" I think we kind of just basically went to explore them, but I think also kind of exploring them and kind of understanding, like I said, why people think this and how they kind of get spread helps to dispel them.
Oh, well, Jace is someone I do not know. I think that was on one of the Facebook pages I shared it to. Do you have in front of you the Facebook page?
Yeah, let me find out real quick because
it's the Humanist Society of Central Ohio. Go ahead and say it correctly.
Humanist Community of Central Ohio.
That's a Facebook page. I sometimes post there. Thank you for allowing me to post there. And if you're in Ohio or Central Ohio, please check them out. I do not know this Jace person. I think what Jace was asking, though, was whether or not this was going to be, shall we say, a pro-conspiracy theory conversation or a debunking conspiracy theory. Now, I don't mean to Jace-splain Jace. If Jace meant something different, please correct me. But that's how I took their question.
Right.
So, I mean, I do want to, I think we could use that as a good question to end on, I can sort of make this comment in summary of our conversation, in the sense that I think skeptics should be open-minded to evidence. And given that there are, in fact, conspiracies in history and in government, I am open to evidence. But what is colloquially referred to as conspiracy theories, we didn't land on the moon, the earth is flat, Sandy Hook, blah, blah, blah. Those stories, those narratives are bereft of compelling evidence and definitely do not have a balance of evidence. As it happens, except for the occasional example, John, you and I didn't really talk about like why conspiracy theory X is simply wrong. We wound up spending 80% of our time talking about the psychology conspiracy, like why do they even exist? Why are people interested in them? And in some ways, that's kind of its own interesting topic, because I also think for people who do want to debunk or debate conspiracy theories, it is kind of like a psychological debate, not an evidence-based debate. I don't want to say know your enemy, because I don't consider these people enemies. I consider them human beings, and not everybody is going to be woke at the same rate. So,
but know your topic, though. Know what you're getting into, and how, because I think the biggest thing, and this is kind of the last thing I'll say as a wrap up. The biggest thing I am kind of working on myself is like the backfire effect. Like once you have it in your mind that this is true, you're gonna kind of, every new piece of information you're going to weigh against that thing that you already think is true. And once, you get in that position of cognitive dissonance, when you're realizing what you want to believe is true isn't true, a lot of times you just dig in even more, and you just completely ignore any other reality and just really double down on that belief. So I kind of have to work on not kind of like just banging people's head against the wall with this reality they don't want to deal with, and kind of just give it to them in small doses and let them digest it a little bit.
Yeah, like the guy I had brunch with a couple of weeks ago, he's well read, and he's not stupid at all. He has just gone down like a narrative path that is way down the so-called rabbit hole. So, that guy's not going to change his mind in 1 minute. But if I can, give him things to think about. There's an old computer programming saying, garbage in, garbage out. So you got to do the best you can to sort of monitor what you're intaking, look for evidence, and logical arguments and logical fallacies and so on and so forth. Well, John, go ahead. One of the best.
The last thing for me is one of the best things for me is just finding a good epistemology of how do I determine what's true and what's not true, and just weigh things against that each and every time. So at least you have something somewhat consistent as far as how to determine reality or so.
We mentioned briefly at the beginning, John, that because we're now living in pandemic times, there's less live entertainment and less audiences as people prudently stay home. You have done or do comedy in the Cleveland area. I know, right? I did that on purpose just for you. Do you have any shows coming up, or what do you got to plug?
So we're still waiting for Brothers Lounge to come back online, because they're like a venue, so they're not really doing much. They're not even reopened yet. But hopefully we'll get that back up and running, once everything kind of cleared up.
And that's in Cleveland, right? Brothers Lounge in Cleveland?
Yep, right off 117th in Detroit there. And then Kelly Moore and I have been working on kind of getting out a podcast, kind of in the same vein as this topic of looking into, we call it an open door with Hensler and Moore. And we kind of just look at stuff that is maybe interesting to us that maybe we haven't really looked into, or look into things that maybe we're skeptical on, and maybe take a different approach of, let's go to a psychic and see if there's anything there. Let's get our auras read, and kind of just really look at things with a skeptical mindset, but like you said, still that open-minded mindset of, is this true? And if it's not, then why is it not? If it is, then why is it? And what's convincing about it?
Well, good. And having the experiences will give you something to talk about.
Right. So we're kind of developing that, and we're probably going to be doing it on this platform at first once we do it. So I don't know, maybe mentioning it will kind of help us get our butts in gear and actually do it. So
it's been known to happen. Hey, you do remind me to anybody in the Cleveland area who knows me. Again, it might be two people listening right now. I've historically done a show and mentor at the Bar Toth's place, and that got shut down in the spring. At that time, it was the longest running independently produced comedy show in a single venue in the state of Ohio. Yay! With that and 50 cents, you can buy a cup of coffee in 1972. I will say over the summer, the bar did reopen. me and the owner Mike talked over the summer and wanted to hold off on restarting the comedy show. Just we wanted to both feel like it was a good idea from a health perspective. Plus, for him as a bar, there's things he has to manage for the health perspective. So the show remains on hiatus. All right. I think having covered that seems like a natural, if awkward, place to stop. And being awkward is my superpower, so I should own it.
Naturally awkward is what we do best, Chair.
Heck yes. So we've had a number of live listeners. I'll just thank you guys, and we've been doing some of the chat room, so I appreciate all of your input there. Do watch out for the live episode. It'll come out in a week or so. Or not the live, this is a live episode. I'll edit that out so I sound more smooth. Do look out for the podcast episode, which I'll release in about a week or so. Go back to the back catalog where there's a lot of interviews with people like John Fugelsang and Steve Hofstetter and other comedians that you may know and love. And otherwise, thank you very much for listening. My name's Jerry. John, say thank you and goodbye one more time.
Thank you and goodbye one more time.
Thank you and goodbye, everybody.